At dawn in 1860, a plantation owner was found hanging from a ceiling beam, and beneath his bare feet lay an open ledger, still wet with ink that no human hand had written. They called it Harrifield Plantation, a wide stretch of cotton land in the low, choking heat of the American South. From a distance, it looked peaceful. White columns, tall oaks, wind moving softly through Spanish moss like breathing. But people who lived nearby said the air always felt wrong there. Too still, too heavy, like the land was holding something in. Harrifield was known for its numbers. Perfect numbers. While nearby plantations struggled, Harrifield thrived. No missing supplies. No unexplained losses. No debts. Every pound of cotton, every nail, every mouth fed was recorded with terrifying precision. The owner, Elias Crow, liked to boast that he ran the cleanest books in 3 counties. What he never explained was who kept them. The ledger books were not written by Elias. They were not written by his overseers. They were written by an enslaved man known only as the accountant. No one knew his real name. He was said to be thin, silent, and always watching. He worked at a small desk in a locked room behind the main house, copying numbers late into the night by candlelight. He never made mistakes. Not once. When cotton went missing, the ledger already showed it gone, hours before anyone noticed. When someone died on the fields, the book had already adjusted the food rations. People whispered that the ledgers were not records. They were instructions. In the spring of 1860, Elias Crow ordered a full audit. He believed someone was stealing from him. That night, he took the main ledger into his bedroom. He locked the door. He dismissed the guards. No one heard a scream. By morning, Crow was dead. The ledger was open, and every page, every single one, had been rewritten in a hand that looked like it had been carved into the paper. And at the very end, beneath a list of names that had never appeared before, was a single line. Account closed. After that morning, the accountant was never seen again. But the books remained, and they were not finished. After Elias Crow's death, the plantation did not stop. That was the first wrong thing. No chaos followed. No panic. The fields ran on time. Food was measured exactly. Cotton shipments left on schedule. Even the dogs were fed at the same hour every day. It was as if the plantation no longer needed a master. Crow's bedroom was sealed by the county sheriff. But the small room behind the main house, the accounting room, was never officially opened. The door had no keyhole on the outside. Inside that room sat a single desk, a chair worn smooth by years of use, and shelves packed tight with ledgers. Hundreds of them. Some thin, some thick, all marked with dates, all written in the same tight, sharp handwriting. The sheriff tried to force the door. It would not move. They brought tools, crowbars, axes. Nothing worked. One man claimed the wood felt soft, almost warm, like flesh beneath bark. Another swore he heard scratching on the other side, slow and patient, like someone waiting. They gave up by sunset. By church time the next morning, rumors spread fast. People whispered that the room had swallowed the accountant whole. Others said he was never a man to begin with, just a shape made of hunger and numbers. The enslaved workers were quieter than usual. They avoided the back of the house. Some refused to pass it at all. One woman crossed herself and said the ledgers were alive, that they listened. 3 days after Crow's death, the first fire broke out. A cotton shed ignited without a spark. Flames moved against the wind, curling inward instead of out. When the fire died, only one thing was left untouched, a single ledger, lying open in the ash. On its page was a list of names. Not inventory, not supplies, people. Some of the names were crossed out. The plantation kept breathing, but something else had started counting the breaths. By the end of that week, no one at Harrifield trusted time anymore. Days passed, but nothing aged the way it should. Food stayed fresh too long. Wounds closed without scarring. And the ledgers, those books, kept updating themselves. The new owner, Elias Crow's cousin Samuel, arrived from Charleston with lawyers and papers and a tight mouth. He wanted order. He wanted control. Most of all, he wanted answers. He ordered the ledgers burned. They would not burn. Fire licked their pages and slid away like water. The leather covers darkened but never caught. One man swore the ink pulsed when the flames came close, like veins under skin. Samuel did what men like him always did when confused by something they could not own. He doubled down. He forced workers into the accounting room for the first time since Crow's death. The door opened easily now. Too easily. Inside, the air smelled old and sweet, like rotting paper and iron. The desk was empty. No chair. No man. Just books. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Ledgers dated years before the plantation existed. Ledgers with no dates at all. Some were written in English. Some were not. Symbols repeated over and over. Marks that looked less like letters and more like scars. Samuel opened one at random. It contained his childhood. Not metaphorically. Literally. The page described a fever he'd had at age 7. A dog he'd beaten to death at 12. A lie he told his mother that sent another boy to the whipping post. All written in that same sharp hand. He slammed the book shut. Another ledger slid forward on its own. This one listed future shipments. Cotton, corn, human bodies. Under projected loss, it listed Samuel Crow. Date, September 3rd, 1860. He locked the room again. That night, the plantation church bell rang without anyone pulling the rope. Once, twice, then 13 times. People woke to find their names scratched into doorframes. Some found ledgers under their beds, damp as if pulled from a river. The enslaved workers began to understand something the owners could not. The accountant had never served the plantation. The plantation had been serving him. Every number was a promise. Every record a binding. And the debt was coming due. September arrived heavy and wet. The air pressed down on Harrifield like a hand on a throat. Even the birds stayed quiet. People stopped sleeping. When they closed their eyes, they saw pages. Lines. Columns. Endless counting. Samuel Crow tried to leave. On the morning of September 2nd, he ordered his carriage prepared. He packed no furniture, no books, no family heirlooms. Just clothes and money. He avoided the accounting room entirely. But the plantation would not let him go. The horses refused to move. They screamed and reared as if the road ahead was a cliff. One collapsed, foaming at the mouth. The driver ran, crying that something was whispering numbers into his ears. Samuel laughed it off. Loud. Too loud. That night, the ledger appeared in his bedroom. It sat on the chair across from his bed, open, as if waiting to be read. The candle beside it was already lit. Ink on the page was still moving, slowly darkening as if drying. The page was titled Corrections. Under it was a list of mistakes. Mistakes Samuel had made that day. A meal he skipped. A prayer he did not say. A man he struck too hard. A name he forgot to record. At the bottom of the page, a single line was being written, stroke by stroke. Samuel Crow, balance pending. He screamed for help. No one came. At dawn on September 3rd, workers found Samuel in the accounting room. His body was folded neatly beneath the desk, knees drawn in, arms crossed like a child hiding. His mouth was stuffed with torn ledger pages. His fingers were black with ink. On the desk sat the main book. Samuel's name was crossed out. Below it, a new heading appeared. Plantation liabilities, expanding. After that, people stopped pretending this was just bad luck. The enslaved workers began whispering a new truth among themselves. They said the accountant had been watching long before Harrifield was built. They said the ledgers were older than cotton, older than chains. They said numbers were just another way to name suffering. And suffering, once counted, never forgot. The plantation gates remained open, but no one tried to leave anymore. After Samuel Crow's death, the plantation entered a new phase. No one gave orders anymore. Work still happened. Bells still rang. Meals were still served at exact times. But there was no voice behind it. No hand. Just routine, cold, perfect, unchanging. The enslaved workers noticed something first. Pain no longer disappeared. A lash left a mark that never faded. A broken finger healed crooked, always aching. Grief sat heavier, lasting longer. It was as if the land itself had started remembering everything it once tried to bury. And the ledgers reflected it. A woman named Ruth was forced into the accounting room to clean. She couldn't read well, but she knew what she saw. The columns no longer listed cotton or tools. They listed suffering. Hours of hunger. Nights without sleep. Children taken. Names erased. Each act had a number beside it. Each number added to a total at the bottom of the page. Ruth said the total changed even when no one was in the room. When she reached the last page, her hands began to shake. The final column was labeled Outstanding Balance. It was never zero. The plantation preacher tried to intervene. He brought his Bible into the accounting room and began to pray, voice loud and shaking. He spoke of forgiveness, of salvation, of debts erased. The ledgers responded. Ink spread across the open page, bleeding outward until it formed a sentence. No forgiveness without payment. The preacher fled that night. By morning, his Bible lay open on the pulpit, its pages filled with numbers written in the same sharp hand. After that, the church doors stayed shut. People began to understand the true horror. The accountant had not been keeping track of money. He had been counting harm. Every cruelty recorded. Every silence noted. Every benefit taken without return added to a growing sum. And now that sum was demanding resolution. The plantation had lived off stolen lives. And now the books were calling it what it was. A debt that could not be escaped. The name did not appear all at once. It surfaced slowly, like a body rising through dark water. Late one night, an older man named Josiah, one of the longest living workers on the land, asked to see the ledgers. No one stopped him. By then, fear had replaced authority. Fear had replaced everything. Josiah could read. He had learned in secret, decades earlier, from scraps of paper stolen and hidden. He had never told anyone. Words were dangerous, but numbers were worse. He opened the oldest ledger on the shelf. It was dated before Hereford existed, before Elias Crow's family-owned land, before the house, the church, the fields. The entries were sparse at first, short, brutal, names, ages, prices, then punishments, then deaths. The same handwriting ran through all of it. At the very front of the book, written smaller than the rest, almost ashamed of itself, was a name. Not the accountant. A real name. A human one. Josiah whispered it out loud, and the candle flickered like it had been struck. The name belonged to a boy once sold away from his mother. A boy who learned numbers because numbers never lied. Numbers never pretended mercy. Numbers did not forget. The ledger explained what no one else ever had. The boy had been trained to count for the plantation, to track profits, losses, bodies. He learned quickly, too quickly. And at the very end, beneath a list of names that had never appeared before, was a single line. Account closed. After that morning, the accountant was never seen again. But the books remained, and they were not finished. After Elias Crow's death, the plantation did not stop. That was the first wrong thing. No chaos followed. No panic. The fields ran on time. Food was measured exactly. Cotton shipments left on schedule. Even the dogs were fed at the same hour every day. It was as if the plantation no longer needed a master. Crow's bedroom was sealed by the county sheriff. But the small room behind the main house, the accounting room, was never officially opened. The door had no keyhole on the outside. Inside that room sat a single desk, a chair worn smooth by years of use, and shelves packed tight with ledgers. Hundreds of them. Some thin, some thick, all marked with dates, all written in the same tight, sharp handwriting. The sheriff tried to force the door. It would not move. They brought tools, crowbars, axes. Nothing worked. One man claimed the wood felt soft, almost warm, like flesh beneath bark. Another swore he heard scratching on the other side, slow and patient, like someone waiting. They gave up by sunset. By church time the next morning, rumors spread fast. People whispered that the room had swallowed the accountant whole. Others said he was never a man to begin with, just a shape made of hunger and numbers. The enslaved workers were quieter than usual. They avoided the back of the house. Some refused to pass it at all. One woman crossed herself and said the ledgers were alive, that they listened. 3 days after Crow's death, the first fire broke out. A cotton shed ignited without a spark. Flames moved against the wind, curling inward instead of out. When the fire died, only one thing was left untouched: a single ledger, lying open in the ash. On its page was a list of names. Not inventory, not supplies, people. Some of the names were crossed out. One night, Josiah watched as the main ledger wrote on its own, the quill scratching fast and angry. It listed punishments that had never been punished. Murders called accidents. Lives written off as necessary. Then the ink slowed. A question appeared at the bottom of the page. Who will settle? By morning, the plantation owners who remained gathered in the house. They argued. They prayed. They blamed each other. Finally, they agreed on the only solution they understood. They would destroy the source. They dragged every ledger outside and piled them high. Oil was poured. Torches raised. The fire lit. The ledgers screamed. Not with sound, with movement. Pages flapped like wings. Ink ran upward, forming shapes that looked almost like faces. The fire burned hot, bright, and fast. When it died, the pile was gone. So was the ground beneath it. The earth had opened wide, swallowing ash, books, and stone alike. That night, the main ledger reappeared in the accounting room. Untouched, open, waiting. After the fire failed, fear turned inward. No one trusted anyone else. Every glance felt like an accusation. Every silence felt recorded. People began whispering less, not because they were calm, but because they were afraid the ledgers were listening. And they were. The main book grew thicker overnight. Pages appeared between pages. New sections formed without being written. Columns tightened, margins shrank, as if the book itself were making room for what was coming. The heading at the top of every page was the same now. Settlement in progress. The first to be taken was not an owner. It was the overseer. A man named Briggs, known for his cruelty, vanished during the night. His room was untouched. His boots stood by the door. His whip lay coiled on the table. In the accounting room, his name was crossed out. Next to it was a number so large no one could understand it. The ledgers did not explain how payment worked. They only showed that it was happening. People began to dream of numbers. Endless rows stretching into darkness. Each number whispered a memory. Someone crying, someone begging, someone being silenced. Sleep became unbearable. Waking felt worse. The church bell rang again, this time without stopping. It rang until the rope snapped. That same night, the plantation house began to crack. Not collapse, crack. Thin lines ran through the walls like veins. Old portraits fell, frames shattering, faces splitting down the middle. In one room, a woman found a ledger page pinned to the wall with a nail. It listed her children, all of them, including the ones she had lost and never spoken of again. At the bottom of the page was a date. Tomorrow. People finally tried to run. They made it as far as the tree line. Every path led back to the house. The plantation was no longer a place. It was an account, and accounts do not let debtors leave. By dawn, the ledger added a final note beneath the day's totals. Escape attempts denied. The land had stopped asking. Now it was collecting. By mid-September, Harrifield no longer followed the calendar. Days repeated. Nights stretched. The sun rose late and set early, as if time itself were being charged interest. The ledger began organizing people by family, not households, bloodlines. Names appeared stacked beneath surnames that went back generations. Fathers, sons, grandfathers, dates of birth written beside dates of cruelty. Some entries reached back before Harrifield existed, before the land was cleared, before the house was built. The message was clear. This was never just about one plantation. It was about inheritance. A young woman named Clara Crow, Elias's niece, opened a ledger hoping to find proof this wasn't real. Instead, she found herself listed under a heading marked Beneficiaries. Beside her name was a sum she could not understand. The page explained it plainly. She had never owned a slave, never held a whip, never ordered punishment, but she had lived comfortably on money made from stolen lives. She had eaten well. She had been educated. She had prayed in a church built by unpaid hands. The ledger counted all of it. Clara tore the page out. Her hands began to shake immediately. Blood dripped from her nose onto the paper. The ink drank it in, darkening, thickening. That night, her name reappeared in the book. The number had grown. People began to beg. They confessed out loud. They wrote apologies. They tried to repay with money, land, promises. None of it mattered. The ledgers did not respond to regret. They responded to balance. Josiah realized something terrifying. The accountant was no longer directing the process. The books had become self-sustaining. Pain had been counted for so long that it had learned how to count itself. A final column appeared across every open page. Unpaid, transferred for collection. The plantation house lights went out all at once. In the dark, people heard footsteps that did not belong to any living body. Slow, measured, always stopping just outside locked doors. Always counting. That was the night people saw the ledgers move. Not fall, not slide. Walk. One by one, books lifted themselves from the shelves of the accounting room. Their spines bent like joints. Pages opened and closed like slow breathing. They moved across the floor in careful lines, never touching each other, never rushing. Always orderly. They spread through the plantation house. A ledger stopped outside every occupied room. If a door was unlocked, The book entered. If it was locked, the book waited. Inside the rooms, people were forced to read. Pages turned on their own, stopping only when the reader reached something they could not deny. A face they remembered hurting. A command they gave without thinking. A moment they benefited from silence. No one saw visions. They saw records. That was worse. One man tried to destroy the book in his room. He smashed it against the wall until the cover split. Inside, there were no pages, only names written over each other, layered so thick they looked like black cloth. The names were screaming. By morning, he was gone. The ledger lay closed on the floor. Another name crossed out. Outside, the fields changed. Cotton wilted, then blackened, then collapsed into dust. Rows of plants fell in perfect sequence, as if following a calculation. The enslaved workers gathered together for the first time without fear of punishment. No overseers came. No bells rang. They understood something no one else had yet accepted. This was not revenge. Revenge is emotional, messy, loud. This was accounting. Cold. Exact. Finished only when the sum reached zero. Josiah returned to the accounting room alone. The main ledger waited for him, open to a page near the end. There were fewer names now. Many crossed out. Some smudged, as if removed violently. At the bottom of the page was a new line. Final review pending. Josiah whispered, "What happens after?" The book answered. Ink formed slowly, carefully, as if choosing the right words. Remainder must be carried. Josiah understood. Some debts never disappear. They move forward. The plantation church opened its doors for the last time without permission. No bell rang. No preacher stood at the pulpit. The doors simply swung wide, slow and heavy, like something exhaling after holding its breath for decades. Inside, every pew was filled, not with bodies, with ledgers. They sat upright, perfectly aligned, covers facing forward as if waiting for a sermon. The altar was buried beneath stacks of books tied together with twine that looked old enough to crumble. The Bible was still there, but it had been pushed aside, half open, its pages blank. People gathered at the doorway, frozen. They understood the message immediately. This place had always been part of the accounting. Every prayer used to excuse cruelty. Every sermon that turned pain into duty. Every silence dressed up as faith. All of it had been recorded. A single ledger lay open at the pulpit. The page listed baptisms. But instead of water, each name was marked with loss. A mother separated. A body broken. A life bent into obedience. Faith, it seemed, had been another column. Another way to balance evil without fixing it. A man stepped forward and tried to pray. The ledger answered first. Words without repair do not count. The doors slammed shut. From outside, people heard the sound of pages turning. Fast now, aggressive, like a storm moving through paper. The church began to shake, not from force, but from weight. The past pressing inward. The building collapsed just before dawn. When the dust settled, nothing remained but the foundation stones and a single ledger lying in the open air. Rain fell. The book did not get wet. A new heading appeared. Institutional losses closed. After that, no one spoke of salvation. They spoke of totals. They spoke of what could still be done. Because something else had changed. The ledgers were no longer writing alone. Some pages had space left. And space meant choice. The blank spaces terrified them more than the crossed-out names. For the first time, the ledgers were not complete. At the bottom of certain pages, after long lists of harm and loss, there were empty lines. No numbers. No dates. Just room. Waiting. Josiah understood before anyone else did. The books were not only ending lives. They were offering a final choice. The plantation gathered in silence near the accounting room. Not as owners and workers. Not as masters and enslaved. Just people trapped inside a system that had finally turned around to face them. Josiah spoke carefully. The books counted what was taken, he said. Now they're counting what's returned. No one answered him. Because returning meant giving up comfort. Land. Power. Names. Safety. It meant undoing what had been built on top of suffering. And undoing hurts. A woman stepped forward first. One of the Crow family. Her hands shook as she opened a ledger and wrote her own name into a blank line. Not under ownership. Under loss. She wrote what she had taken. What she had ignored. What she had gained. The ink did not resist her. The number beside her name appeared small. But real. Others followed. Some could not bring themselves to write. Those names stayed blank. Heavy. Unforgiven. The plantation itself began to change. The air lightened slightly. The ground stopped cracking. Wells cleared. Food spoiled normally again. Time resumed its slow, painful movement. But not everyone was spared. Those who refused to acknowledge their debt began to vanish quietly. No drama. No struggle. Just absence. Their names were crossed out with a clean, final line. One ledger reached its last page. At the bottom, written smaller than the rest, was a sentence no one expected. Accountant no longer required. The room felt empty for the first time, as if something had finally stepped back. Once the line, accountant no longer required, appeared, the books stopped moving. They did not vanish. They did not burn. They simply became still, heavy again, ordinary in shape, if not in meaning. That's when they found the body. Behind the accounting room, beneath a patch of earth that never grew grass, workers uncovered a shallow grave. No marker, no coffin, just bones wrapped in rotted cloth, curled inward as if protecting something. Clutched against the ribcage was a slate board. Numbers were scratched into it so deeply they had carved grooves into the stone. Totals. Corrections. Tallies ending abruptly, mid-column. This was where the accountant had gone. Not taken. Placed. Josiah knelt beside the remains and felt something loosen in his chest. The bones were small. Too small for a man who had lived decades on the plantation. He realized the truth then. The accountant had died young. Very young. The body had been kept. Hidden. Uncounted. The ledgers had continued without him. People had assumed the books were haunted by a man. But the man had been buried while the system lived on. That was the real horror. The plantation held a quiet burial. No prayers. No sermons. Just soil and silence. The slate was placed back in the ground with the bones. For the first time, a name appeared in the ledger without a number beside it. Just a name. Just acknowledgement. The land exhaled. But the ledgers did not disappear. They were packed into crates. Some were taken by officials. Some vanished into private collections. Some were stolen. Some were lost to fires that finally burned hot enough. And some survived. Because records always do. Harrifield Plantation was abandoned within a year. The fields were reclaimed by weeds. The house collapsed. The church foundation cracked and sank. But the books traveled. And wherever they went, strange things followed. People who owned them dreamed of numbers. Families found old sins resurfacing. Institutions began to fail quietly, precisely. The accounting was no longer localized. It had gone portable. After Harrifield emptied, the story should have ended. It didn't. The ledgers were cataloged like artifacts. Some were seized by county officials. Others were sold quietly to collectors who liked owning pieces of history without touching what they meant. A few were donated to universities, locked away in archives no one bothered to read closely. And everywhere they went, the same pattern followed. A lawyer in Virginia who kept one ledger on his shelf began waking at 3:17 every morning. He dreamed of courtrooms filled with empty chairs and verdicts written before trials began. Within a year, his firm collapsed after a scandal no one could explain. A northern seminary acquired 3 books labeled agricultural records. Students complained the building felt wrong. Enrollment dropped. 2 professors resigned after discovering old letters that exposed how the school had once trained preachers to justify bondage as divine order. In New York, a private collector displayed a ledger behind glass. Visitors reported headaches. One woman fainted after reading a page that listed her family name, along with dates matching stories her grandmother refused to tell. The ledgers did not announce themselves. They did not threaten. They simply revealed. Always with numbers. Always with proof. Archivists began noticing strange things. Pages that hadn't been there before. Ink that darkened when discussed aloud. Margins filling themselves overnight with notes correcting official histories. One librarian wrote in a private journal, "These books behave like they're waiting for someone to lie." By the 1890s, references to the Harrifield ledgers stopped appearing in public records. Not because they were gone, but because institutions learned something important. You don't destroy a record. You bury it under newer ones. But the ledgers adapted. They stopped focusing on plantations. They began tracking factories, orphanages, prisons, schools, churches, any place where suffering could be organized, justified, and repeated. Anywhere numbers replaced people. The accountant was gone. But the accounting had learned how to continue without a hand. And the balance, always incomplete, kept rolling forward. The first orphanage appeared in the ledgers in 1904. It wasn't labeled as cruelty. It wasn't labeled as abuse. It was labeled efficiency. A brick building outside St. Louis, praised in newspapers for saving children from the streets. Clean beds, uniform meals, strict rules. Donations flowed in. Respect followed. The ledger told a different story. Each child was assigned a number. Each number had a weight. Hunger was measured in hours. Silence in days. Punishment in repetitions. The book tracked which children cried quietly and which learned not to cry at all. It tracked how long it took before a child stopped asking for their name and answered only to their number. When a boy died of pneumonia, the ledger noted that his bed was filled within 12 hours. No loss to output. The woman who ran the orphanage found the ledger in a crate of donated books. She didn't know why she kept it. She said it made her feel organized, focused, powerful. At night, she dreamed of columns lining up perfectly. When inspectors arrived, the ledger updated before they spoke. Complaints appeared before they were made. Testimonies were rewritten as misunderstandings. The system protected itself. Until one night, a child learned to read. He opened the book and found himself listed under projected savings. The next morning, the boiler malfunctioned. Only one room filled with smoke. Only one bed was empty afterward. The ledger crossed out a name. Below it, a new note appeared. Institutional debt escalating. The orphanage closed within 2 years. Officially for lack of funds. Unofficially, because too many questions started lining up. The ledger disappeared. Then it surfaced again. Different city. Different building. Same columns. By the time anyone noticed the pattern, the books had already moved on. They always did. Because harm changes shape. But it never stops counting. By the 1920s, the ledgers looked different. Thinner paper. Cleaner ink. Neater margins. They had adapted. Factories replaced fields. Machines replaced whips. Time clocks replaced chains. And the books learned a new language. Productivity. Output. Acceptable loss. A textile mill in Pennsylvania kept a ledger in the foreman's office. No one remembered ordering it. It was just there. Every shift, numbers were already filled in. Accidents were predicted before they happened. Fingers lost. Lungs ruined. A man crushed beneath a belt. Always accurate. The foreman trusted the book more than his workers. If the ledger showed no injury, a man claiming pain was sent back to work. If the ledger showed a death coming, the floor was scrubbed early. When a woman collapsed from exhaustion, the ledger marked it as inefficient labor. When she didn't return, her line vanished. No one asked where it went. The mill broke records. Profits soared. Awards followed. So did the dreams. Workers dreamed of gears grinding bones into powder, of hands turning into numbers, of clocks that never stopped ticking, even after the heart did. A strike was attempted. The ledger adjusted. Names of organizers appeared under disruption costs. One by one, they were fired, arrested, injured, forgotten. The movement died quietly. By the time inspectors shut the mill down years later, the building was empty. Machines sat idle. Dust covered everything. In the office, the ledger lay open. On the final page was a familiar line. Remainder transferred. The book was gone by morning. By then, the accounting had fully detached from place. It didn't need plantations anymore. It didn't need overseers. It didn't need cruelty to look like cruelty. It only needed systems. And systems always love numbers. In 1937, a junior clerk at a federal records office found a file with no request number. No stamp. No signature. No reason to be there. It was thin. Just a few pages. Brown paper. Typed headings. Handwritten notes in the margins. The title read, Harrifield Accounting Summary. The clerk had never heard the name. Inside were tables that made no sense for a government file. Not budgets. Not census data. Columns labeled loss, extraction, compliance, silence. Each row listed an institution. Schools. Hospitals. Prisons. Factories. Orphanages. Some were still operating. Some had burned down. Some had been renamed. Some officially never existed. At the bottom of the last page was a total. It was crossed out. Under it, someone had typed, Total cannot be finalized. The clerk did what clerks are trained to do. He filed it away. That night, he dreamed of standing in a long hallway lined with filing cabinets. Each drawer was labeled with a year. When he opened one, names spilled out instead of paper. They piled at his feet until he couldn't move. In the morning, the file was back on his desk. It had grown thicker. New pages had been added. Recent dates. Familiar places. Events that had not yet happened but felt inevitable when read. The clerk tried to report it. His supervisor told him the file didn't exist. He showed it anyway. By the end of the week, the supervisor was reassigned. By the end of the month, the clerk was too. The file remained. It followed him. Wherever he worked, it appeared. Always updated. Always incomplete. He began to understand the pattern. The accounting was no longer about punishment. It was about continuity. As long as systems benefited from quiet harm, the ledger stayed open. As long as people looked away, the total kept growing. The file did not accuse. It waited. By the early 1940s, the file had stopped pretending to be historical. Dates on the pages crept closer to the present. Then they began to overlap it. Factories still running. Schools still open. Hospitals still praised in newspapers. All listed under the same cold columns. Loss measured not in bodies now, but in years taken. Futures narrowed. Voices trained to stay quiet. The clerk was no longer young. He had tried everything. Burning pages. Locking drawers. Losing the file on purpose. It always returned. Sometimes thicker. Sometimes cleaner. Always correct. One night, alone in the records room, he noticed something new. A blank page at the end. At the top, a simple heading. Current custodian. Below it, nothing. The clerk understood the rule by now. What is left blank is waiting. He thought of the boy buried behind the accounting room. The man who learned to count pain because no one else would. The system that kept going after the body was gone. The clerk picked up a pen. His hand shook. For the first time, the file did not resist being written in. He wrote his name. Not as owner. Not as keeper. As witness. The room felt lighter. Not safe. Just honest. The file closed itself. In the morning, it was gone. No reassignment followed. No quiet punishment. The clerk finished his career and retired without incident. He told no one what he had seen. Years later, after his death, his family found a single notebook among his things. Inside were no numbers. Only sentences. Names remembered. Stories written out fully. Pain described instead of summarized. On the last page, a line written carefully, slowly. Nothing counted disappears. But what is named can finally rest. The notebook was donated to a small local library. It was cataloged incorrectly and never corrected. By the time anyone tried to piece the story together, there was nothing left to point at. Hereford Plantation no longer existed on maps. The land had been divided, sold, renamed. Children played where the accounting room once stood. No one felt anything strange anymore, at least not consciously. But absence can be quieter than haunting. Historians notice gaps, sudden closures with no explanation, institutions that failed for unknown reasons, families that lost wealth overnight without scandal, patterns that almost lined up if you looked too closely. Most people didn't, because the accounting never announces itself. It doesn't slam doors or rattle chains. It appears as discomfort, as unease when reading old reports, as the sense that something essential was skipped over. Every so often, a ledger resurfaces. Not the same kind. Not leather-bound. Not handwritten. Spreadsheets. Databases. Files with fields that don't quite make sense. Someone adds a column without knowing why. Someone tracks outcomes no one asked them to track. Someone notices the numbers don't balance, even when the report says they do. Those people rarely get promoted, but they remember. And memory is the enemy of clean accounts. The horror of Hereford was never supernatural. It was structural. A system so obsessed with order that it forgot humanity. A belief that if suffering was recorded, it was somehow justified. That once something was written down, it became acceptable. The accountant did not curse the land. He revealed it. And revelation has consequences that echo longer than screams. The ledgers were never destroyed. They became us. If this story feels unfinished, that is not a mistake. That is the point. Because the last ledger never closes on its own. Somewhere, right now, a record is being kept. Not by a ghost. Not by a monster. But by a system that learned long ago how to look neutral while doing harm. Somewhere, numbers are being used to smooth over pain. To explain it away. To call it necessary. To call it progress. And somewhere, a blank line waits. The accountant was not a demon. He was a witness forced into silence, taught to count what no one wanted named. When his body was buried, the counting did not stop, because the need to avoid responsibility did not stop. That is the real inheritance of Hereford. Not a haunted book, but a habit. a habit of turning lives into data, of turning cruelty into efficiency, of turning silence into compliance. The ledgers don't need to move anymore. They sit in policies, in reports, in systems that benefit from forgetting where their numbers come from. And every time someone notices the imbalance, every time someone asks who pays for this, the accounting stirs. Because debts denied don't disappear. They carry, they wait, they transfer. And someday, whether written or not, whether acknowledged or not, every system must face the same line that appeared at Harrowfield long ago. Account still open.